In the heart of a bustling city, an ordinary morning took a dramatic turn when a respected man found himself in handcuffs at the hands of two officers whose intentions were far from just. What began as a routine encounter quickly escalated into something far more troubling, leaving onlookers stunned and questioning what they had witnessed. The man's calm demeanor masked a deeper truth, one that would soon send shockwaves through the entire police department. As his identity came to light, it became clear this was no ordinary arrest. The officers, blindsided by their own biases, had unknowingly stepped into a situation that would challenge not only their careers, but the very foundation of justice in their community. What happened next would leave the city holding its breath, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power, accountability, and the fight for fairness. But before we get into the details, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The morning sun stretched its golden fingers over the city's skyline, casting a warm glow across the streets below. The air buzzed with life car horns blared in rhythmic frustration. Distant sirens wailed like restless spirits, and snippets of conversation floated through the crisp breeze. It was an ordinary day in this urban labyrinth, where dreams were chased and struggles endured beneath the towering shadows of glass and steel. Among the throng of hurried pedestrians, Marcus Hale moved with quiet purpose. He was a man who commanded attention not by force but by presence alone. In his mid-30s, Marcus carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from years of navigating a world that often seemed determined to test him. His tailored navy suit fit impeccably, each stitch speaking of discipline and precision. Polished leather shoes clicked against the pavement, echoing softly, marking time alongside the city's heartbeat. A silver watch gleamed on his wrist, a gift from his late father, a reminder of lessons learned and promises kept. Marcus paused briefly at the corner of 5th and Main, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with deliberate care. The fabric whispered against his skin, crisp and immaculate, a reflection of the man himself, composed, meticulous, unyielding. Around him, people rushed past, their faces etched with urgency or fatigue. But Marcus stood apart, unhurried, as though he existed slightly outside the chaos, observing it rather than being consumed by it. There was something almost regal about him, a quiet dignity that made heads turn without him ever asking for it. He had just finished breakfast at Ella's Diner, a cozy spot tucked between two towering office buildings. The staff there knew him well. They greeted him by name, always slipping a little extra fruit onto his plate because Mr. Hale deserves the best. Today, he'd lingered longer than usual, savoring scrambled eggs seasoned perfectly with herbs, turkey bacon cooked to a satisfying crisp, and a side of fresh melon slices. As he left, Ella herself called out after him, her voice warm and maternal. "Take care, Marcus," she said, waving from behind the counter. He smiled back, tipping an imaginary hat before stepping into the cool autumn air. Now, as he approached his car, a sleek charcoal sedan, parked neatly along the curb, his phone vibrated gently in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from his mother. She never forgot to remind him of family dinners, even though he rarely needed prompting. Her words were simple yet filled with love. "Don't forget tonight, sweetheart. 6 o'clock sharp." Marcus chuckled softly, imagining her stern expression softening into a smile as she typed it. He replied quickly, assuring her he wouldn't miss it for anything. Family meant everything to him, it always had. Growing up, his parents had instilled in him the importance of roots, resilience, and respect. Those values had shaped him, guiding him through moments both triumphant and trying. As he slid the phone back into his pocket, Marcus noticed two figures approaching from the opposite end of the street. They wore uniforms, their badges glinting faintly under the sunlight. Officers Blake and Harper. Their eyes locked onto him immediately, unwavering and intense. At first glance, they seemed no different from any other patrolman roaming the neighborhood, yet there was something unsettling about the way they moved, their strides synchronized, their expressions unreadable masks of authority. Marcus slowed his pace, instinctively assessing the situation. Encounters like this weren't unfamiliar to him. Over the years, he'd learned how to navigate them with grace and restraint, thanks to advice passed down from his father. "Stay calm," his dad used to say. "Be respectful. Never give them a reason to escalate things." Those words echoed in his mind now, grounding him as he stopped and turned to face the officers. "Yes, officer?" Marcus asked, his tone measured and polite. He held his phone loosely in one hand, making sure his movements were deliberate and non-threatening. Officer Blake stepped forward, his posture rigid, his gaze piercing. Behind him, Harper hovered, one hand resting casually near his holster. The tension between them was palpable, though Marcus refused to let it show. Instead, he stood tall, meeting their stares with steady eyes, exuding the same quiet strength that had earned him nods of admiration earlier that morning. What began as a routine monumental man walking to his car, officers patrolling their beat was about to take a turn neither side could have anticipated. For Marcus, it was another chapter in a story he'd lived too many times before. For Blake and Harper, it was a decision that would ripple far beyond the confines of this single encounter. And for the city itself, it would become a reckoning long overdue. The morning sun cast long shadows over the bustling streets, its warmth doing little to ease the tension that had begun to simmer. Marcus Hales stood still, his polished shoes planted firmly on the pavement, as officers Blake and Harper approached with an intensity that seemed out of place in the otherwise ordinary scene. Their eyes locked onto him like predators circling prey, their expressions unreadable, but undeniably hostile. Marcus felt it immediately, the shift in the air, the weight of scrutiny that had nothing to do with legality or procedure. He'd been here before, too many times to count. Each encounter was etched into his memory, not because they were rare, but because they were far too common. Growing up, his father had drilled into him the importance of staying calm, of choosing words carefully, of never giving anyone a reason to escalate things further. Those lessons echoed in his mind now, grounding him even as his instincts screamed that this moment was different. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Blake called out, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the city around them. Marcus turned slowly, his movements deliberate, ensuring there was no room for misinterpretation. His phone rested loosely in one hand, its screen glowing faintly from the last message he'd sent to his mother. "Yes, officer," he replied, his tone measured, polity a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his chest. Blake stopped, just a few feet away, close enough for Marcus to see the glint of authority in his eyes, the kind that bordered on arrogance. Harper lingered slightly behind, his hand hovering near his holster, a silent threat masked as routine readiness. "Can I see some ID?" Blake demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. There was no greeting, no explanation, just the unyielding assumption that Marcus owed him compliance. Marcus hesitated for only a fraction of a second, though it felt like an eternity. He knew the drill. He'd been asked this question countless times before. But something about the way Blake said it, the way both officers seemed to loom over him, made his stomach tighten. Still, he kept his composure, refusing to let them see the flicker of unease beneath his calm exterior. "May I ask why?" he responded, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his throat. It wasn't defiance, it was a simple request for clarity, one he was well within his rights to make. Blake's jaw tightened at the question, his lips curling into a smirk that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." The sarcasm in his tone was unmistakable, dripping with condescension. Marcus met his gaze, holding it for a moment longer than necessary, before slowly reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out his wallet with deliberate care, making sure every movement was visible, non-threatening. "All right," he said evenly, handing over his driver's license. "But I'd still like to know why I'm being asked for it." Blake took the card without a word, his eyes scanning it quickly. Behind him, Harper shifted slightly, his posture stiffening as if preparing for something. Marcus noticed the subtle change, his senses heightening. Experience had taught him to read these cues, to anticipate the unpredictable. Yet, he forced himself to remain calm, to focus on breathing steadily, to remind himself that reacting impulsively would only make matters worse. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Blake asked abruptly, his tone accusatory now, as though Marcus's mere presence required justification. Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the sudden escalation. "I'm heading to my car," he answered truthfully, gesturing toward the sleek sedan parked just a few feet away. "Is there a problem?" Blake ignored the question entirely, his gaze narrowing as he studied Marcus's face. "Where are you coming from?" he pressed, his voice laced with suspicion. Marcus clenched his jaw briefly before replying, "I had breakfast at the diner down the street." "Like I said, is there a problem, officer?" For a split second, Blake's mask slipped, revealing a flicker of annoyance. He handed the license back without another word, but the smirk returned as he spoke. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. You match the description of someone we're looking for." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. Suspicious activity. Match the description. Phrases he'd heard so often they might as well have been branded onto his skin. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay composed. "I see," he said carefully, his voice betraying none of the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "Well, I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. I'm just here to get to my car and head to work." Blake didn't respond directly. Instead, he took a step closer, his posture more aggressive now, invading Marcus's personal space. "What kind of work do you do?" he asked, his tone probing, almost mocking. Marcus straightened slightly, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm a lawyer," he replied, his voice even, unwavering. "I have a meeting in an hour, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way." The admission seemed to catch Blake off guard, his smirk faltering for the briefest moment. Harper, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice laced with thinly veiled hostility. "You sure you're not hiding anything? Got anything illegal in that car of yours?" Marcus could feel the tension rising, pressing against him like a physical force. He knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control, how easily assumptions could become accusations, how swiftly respectability could be stripped away. But he also knew that losing his temper, raising his voice, even flinching, would only give them ammunition, so he took a deep breath, steadying himself. "There's nothing illegal in my car, officer," he said firmly. "You're welcome to check, but I'd prefer if you didn't waste your time. I'm just trying to get to work." Blake's eyes hardened, his earlier smirk replaced by something darker, more menacing. "You don't get to decide how we do our job," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. "Step away from the car." Marcus hesitated, his mind racing. Complying meant surrendering what little control he had left, while resisting even passively risked turning the situation volatile. His father's voice echoed in his thoughts once more, urging him to stay calm, to think strategically. With a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his hands slightly, showing they were empty. "All right," he said quietly, taking a step back. "I'll step away." As he moved, Blake closed the distance between them, his hand now resting on the handle of his baton. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to let it show. He couldn't afford to appear afraid, not when fear was exactly what they were looking for, an excuse, a justification. But then, without warning, Blake grabbed Marcus's arm and twisted it behind his back with startling force. Pain shot through Marcus's shoulder, sharp and unexpected. and he winced involuntarily. "Hey, what are you doing?" Marcus protested, his voice strained but controlled. He wasn't resisting, hadn't resisted. Yet Harper was already moving in, grabbing his other arm and forcing him down to the ground. The rough concrete scraped against his cheek as he struggled to process what was happening. This wasn't protocol, it was punishment, plain and simple. And yet there was nothing he could do to stop it. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Blake growled coldly, tightening the cuffs around Marcus's wrists. The irony of the statement struck Marcus like a hammer blow. Resisting arrest? He hadn't resisted anything. He had done everything they asked, tried to reason with them, tried to de-escalate. But none of it mattered. They had made up their minds the moment they saw him. By now, the commotion had drawn attention. People nearby had stopped to watch, their faces a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. An elderly woman standing on the sidewalk called out, her voice trembling with outrage. "He didn't do anything wrong!" A young couple recording the incident muttered angrily to each other, their phones capturing every moment. Marcus caught sight of the camera lenses pointed in his direction and felt a fleeting sense of hope. Maybe the footage would help later. Maybe it would prove what he already knew. This wasn't justice, it was prejudice. As the officers hauled Marcus to his feet, he forced himself to stay calm, to focus. Anything he said now could be twisted, used against him. The crowd grew larger, voices rising in protest as the reality of the situation sank in. "This isn't right," someone shouted from across the street. "He didn't do anything." But Blake and Harper ignored them, their faces set with cold determination as they shoved Marcus into the back of the squad car and slammed the door shut. Through the thin glass of the window, Marcus locked eyes with the crowd one last time. Their expressions mirrored his own emotions, anger, confusion, helplessness. But he refused to let despair take hold. Taking a deep breath, he leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying just loud enough to be heard. "This isn't over," he said firmly, the words hanging in the air like a promise. Then the car pulled away, leaving behind a stunned and restless crowd. Inside the vehicle, Marcus's mind raced. He thought about his family, his career, the life he had built despite the obstacles placed in his path. He thought about the countless others who had faced similar injustices, who had been silenced or dismissed. And he thought about what came next for him, for the officers, for the community watching and waiting for answers. Whatever happened, one thing was certain. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The tension inside the police station had reached a breaking point, like a storm cloud hovering just moments before unleashing its fury. Lieutenant Sarah Collins stood in the dimly lit conference room, her sharp eyes fixed on officers Blake and Harper. The air was thick with unease, every breath seeming to carry the weight of what was about to unfold. Outside, the crowd's chants echoed faintly through the walls, a reminder that this wasn't just an internal matter, it was a reckoning for the entire city. Blake shifted uncomfortably under Collins's piercing gaze, his usual bravado replaced by something far more fragile. Fear. Harper, who had always been the quieter of the two, stared at the floor as if it might swallow him whole. Neither man dared speak first, their silence amplifying the gravity of the situation. Collins crossed her arms, her posture rigid but controlled, as she prepared to deliver the words that would shatter whatever remained of their composure. "I know who Marcus Hale is," she began, her voice low yet cutting through the room like a blade. Her tone left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't a question or a suggestion, it was a declaration. Blake's head snapped up, his face pale, while Harper visibly flinched. For a moment, neither officer moved, their expressions frozen in disbelief. Collins didn't wait for them to respond. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "Marcus Hale isn't just some random individual you pulled off the street. He's a civil rights attorney, a prominent one. And not only that, he's been working undercover for a federal investigation into systemic corruption within law enforcement." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. As the full implications sank in, Harper's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, struggling to find something to say. Blake, however, managed to stammer. We didn't know. Lieutenant, he never said anything about being undercover. We thought. You thought what? Collins interrupted, her voice raising slightly, though still measured. That because he's black, because he's successful, because he exists in a space where people like you feel threatened, that gave you the right to treat him like a criminal. Is that what you're saying? Her words struck like a hammer blow, leaving both men speechless. Blake's face flushed red. Whether from shame or anger, it was impossible to tell. Harper simply looked down again, his hands trembling ever so slightly. Collins could see the realization dawning on them, the enormous mistake they had made. One that went far beyond a wrongful arrest. They had unknowingly targeted someone who could expose decades of misconduct, someone who had been gathering evidence against the very system they represented. Before either officer could muster a response, the door to the conference room burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Chief Michael Sanders stormed in, his face a mask of barely contained rage. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie askew, as though he had rushed here without a second thought. Behind him trailed Agent Mark Russell, a tall, imposing figure whose presence commanded immediate attention. His dark suit was immaculate, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light. If there had been any doubt about the severity of the situation, it vanished the moment Russell stepped into the room. "What the hell is going on here?" Sanders barked, his voice booming and reverberating off the walls. His eyes darted between Collins, Blake, and Harper, searching for answers. But before anyone could reply, Russell raised a hand, silencing the chief mid-sentence. "There's no need for explanations, Chief," Russell said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "I'm well aware of what's happened here." He turned his steely gaze toward Blake and Harper, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. "And let me be clear. This is a very serious matter." Russell paused, allowing his words to settle over the room like a suffocating fog. When he spoke again, his tone was even colder, each syllable deliberate and weighted. "Marcus Hale is a key asset in a federal investigation that has been months in the making. Your actions today have jeopardized not only his cover, but also the integrity of the entire operation. Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done?" Blake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. Harper's knees buckled slightly, forcing him to lean against the table for support. Neither man dared meet Russell's gaze. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the reality of their predicament became undeniable. Sanders, who had initially entered the room brimming with fury, now seemed deflated, his shoulders sagging under the weight of Russell's words. He glanced at Collins, silently pleading for some kind of reassurance, but her expression remained resolute. This wasn't just about damage control anymore, it was about survival. Russell continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Your cooperation moving forward will determine how this plays out. Any resistance, any attempt to obstruct justice will result in swift and decisive consequences. Am I understood?" "Yes, sir," Blake muttered, his voice barely audible. Harper nodded frantically, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "Good," Russell replied curtly. He turned to Collins, his expression softening ever so slightly. "Lieutenant, I expect you to oversee this personally. Ensure there are no further incidents. We cannot afford another misstep." Collins nodded, her jaw tightening. "Understood, Agent Russell." With that, Russell gave a curt nod and turned to leave. As he reached the door, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "And one more thing," he added, his voice dripping with warning. "Consider this your final chance. The federal government is watching closely. Any further misconduct within this department will not be tolerated." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the room in stunned silence. The weight of Russell's words pressed down on everyone, suffocating intensity. Collins exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair as she tried to process everything. Sanders slumped into a chair, his face buried in his hands, while Blake and Harper exchanged panicked looks. But Collins knew there was no time to dwell on the chaos. The clock was ticking, and the community outside demanded answers. She straightened her posture, steeling herself for what came next. Turning to Sanders, she said firmly, "Chief, we need to issue a public apology, and soon. Not just for Marcus Hale, but for everyone who's been failed by this department." Sanders looked up, his eyes bloodshot but resolute. "Do what you have to do, Lieutenant. Just make sure it sticks." As Collins left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she also knew it was a necessary step toward redemption for herself, for the department, and for the community they were sworn to protect. Later that afternoon, Chief Sanders stood outside the station, facing a sea of cameras and microphones. The crowd was restless, their chants for justice growing louder as he approached the podium. For a moment he hesitated, feeling the weight of decades of mistrust bearing down on him. But then he stepped forward, adjusting the microphone and clearing his throat. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but strained. "I want to start by acknowledging the events that took place earlier today. The arrest of Mr. Marcus Hale was a mistake that should never have happened. I take full responsibility for what occurred, and I want to offer my sincerest apologies to Mr. West and to the community." The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, skepticism mingling with anger. Sanders pressed on, his tone somber. "We recognize that this incident is part of a larger problem that has persisted for far too long within our department. I want to assure you all that we are committed to addressing these issues head-on." He outlined the steps the department planned to take: suspending Blake and Harper pending an internal investigation, conducting a thorough review of practices and procedures, and working closely with federal oversight to ensure accountability. But as he spoke, he could see the doubt in their eyes, the weariness that came from years of broken promises. Before he could finish, Marcus stepped forward, raising a hand to stop him. "Chief Sanders," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about words. This is about action. True justice goes beyond a public apology. It requires real change, real accountability, and real commitment." Sanders nodded slowly, stepping back from the microphone. He knew Marcus was right, an apology was just the beginning. The real work was still ahead of them. Marcus turned to face the crowd, his presence commanding their full attention. "We've heard apologies before," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "But what we need now is a commitment to real, lasting change. We need to hold those in power accountable for their actions, and we need to work together to create a system that treats everyone with fairness and dignity." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in agreement. Marcus's words resonated with them, cutting through the anger and frustration that had been building for so long. "This isn't just about what happened to me," he continued, his voice strong and clear. "This is about all of us. It's about every person who has been wronged by a system that's supposed to protect them. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I went through. And it's about ensuring that justice is not just a word but a reality." As the applause swelled, Marcus stepped back from the podium, his message delivered. The crowd's response was overwhelming, a surge of support that filled him with determination. He knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but he was ready for it. He was ready to lead the fight for justice, to hold those in power accountable, and to ensure that the voices of the marginalized were heard. The city had begun to heal, though the scars of its past still lingered like faint lines on an old map. 6 months had passed since Marcus Hale's wrongful arrest, and while the incident itself was a dark chapter in the community's history, it had become a catalyst for change, a spark that ignited a movement no one could have predicted. The air felt different now, charged with a cautious optimism that hadn't existed before. People spoke more openly about justice, accountability, and reform. Conversations once whispered in private were now shouted from podiums, written in bold headlines, and debated at kitchen tables across the city. Inside the police station, Lieutenant Patricia Rich stood by the window of her office, watching as officers moved through the halls below. The atmosphere within these walls had shifted subtly but unmistakably. There was less tension, fewer sidelong glances filled with mistrust or hostility. Officers greeted each other warmly, their interactions tinged with a newfound sense of camaraderie. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but progress was undeniable, and much of that progress could be traced back to the changes implemented after Marcus's arrest. Patricia Rich sighed softly, her gaze drifting to the framed photograph on her desk. It was taken just last month during a community event where she had shared the stage with Marcus Hale. In the picture, they stood side by side, smiling despite the weight of everything they had endured together. That day, Marcus had delivered a powerful speech about resilience, unity, and the importance of holding institutions accountable. His words had resonated deeply not only with the crowd gathered outside, but also with those inside the department who wanted to believe in something better. She remembered how nervous she had been when Marcus first agreed to collaborate with the department. After all, he had every reason to walk away, to focus solely on dismantling systems rather than rebuilding them. But Marcus wasn't interested in revenge. He was driven by purpose. He understood that true justice required more than tearing things down. It demanded building something stronger, fairer, and more equitable in their place. And so, he had worked tirelessly alongside Patricia Rich, Chief Sanders, and others to create programs aimed at fostering trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. One of the most impactful initiatives was the establishment of a community oversight board, comprised of local leaders, activists, legal experts, and even former officers. The board acted as an independent body tasked with reviewing cases of alleged misconduct. Its creation had been met with resistance initially, particularly from veteran officers who viewed it as an intrusion into their work. But over time, even skeptics began to see its value. The board didn't exist to punish, it existed to guide, to hold people accountable without resorting to fear or retaliation. Slowly but surely, it became a bridge connecting two worlds that had long been divided. Another significant step forward was the introduction of comprehensive training programs designed to address implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques. These weren't just PowerPoint presentations or mandatory seminars, they were immersive experiences led by individuals like Marcus himself. Officers participated in workshops where they listened to stories from community members who had been wronged by the system. They engaged in role-playing exercises that forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, prejudice, and power dynamic. Some left these sessions shaken, questioning whether they belonged in law enforcement at all. Others emerged with a renewed commitment to doing better, not because they feared punishment, but because they genuinely believed in the possibility of change. For Marcus, the journey hadn't been easy. He often found himself torn between his roles as an advocate, a mentor, and a symbol of hope. There were days when the weight of expectations threatened to crush him, when the memories of handcuffs biting into his wrists, or the sound of Blake's voice accusing him of resisting arrest replayed endlessly in his mind. Yet, he refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he channeled his pain into action, using his experiences to fuel his fight for systemic transformation. Maria Hernandez, the passionate schoolteacher who had helped develop educational curriculums for the initiative, frequently reminded Marcus of the ripple effect his efforts were creating. "It's not just about what happens today," she would say. "It's about planting seeds that will grow into trees we might never sit under." Those words stayed with him, especially on days when progress felt agonizingly slow. Change, he realized, wasn't linear. It ebbed and flowed, advancing in leaps and bounds one moment and retreating into shadows the next. But as long as there were people willing to nurture those seeds, water them with patience, persistence, and love, they would eventually take root. Tonight, as Marcus sat in his modest office at the Community Justice Initiative, surrounded by stacks of case files and reports, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of his laptop and the occasional rustle of papers being shuffled. Outside, the city buzzed faintly in the background, alive with the sounds of life continuing onward. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly as exhaustion washed over him. The work never truly ended. It stretched endlessly ahead, demanding sacrifices he sometimes wondered if he could sustain. But then he thought about Sarah Johnson, the young recruit who had approached him after his training session earlier that day. Her determination had reminded him why he kept going. She represented a new generation, one unburdened by decades of entrenched biases, yet acutely aware of the challenges they faced. When she thanked him for inspiring her to stay committed to her dream of becoming an officer, Marcus felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. If someone like Sarah could rise above cynicism and doubt, then perhaps the future held promise after all. A knock on the door pulled Marcus from his thoughts. He opened his eyes to see Maria standing in the doorway, her face glowing with excitement. "Marcus," she said breathlessly, "I just got off the phone with the superintendent. They've approved our curriculum for statewide implementation." Marcus rose from his seat, a wide smile spreading across his face. "That's incredible news, Maria. You've done amazing work." Maria beamed but quickly sobered, her expression turning serious. "It's not just my work, Marcus. None of this would have happened without you, without what you went through." Marcus shook his head gently. "I may have been part of the beginning, but this movement is so much bigger than me. It's about all of us working together to create the world we want to see." As they discussed the details of the rollout, Marcus felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This was what real change looked like, no grand gestures or fleeting moments of triumph, but the steady accumulation of small victories that added up to something meaningful. Each lesson taught in classrooms, each policy revised within the department, each life touched by the initiative brought them closer to a vision of justice that transcended badges and courtrooms. Later that evening, as Marcus finally stepped outside, the cool night air greeted him like an old friend. The streets were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Above him, stars twinkled faintly against the vast expanse of sky. For a moment, he paused, letting the serenity wash over him. The road ahead was still long, fraught with obstacles and uncertainties, but as he gazed upward, he felt a deep sense of peace settle in his chest. They were on the right path, not because they had reached the destination, but because they were moving forward together step by step, day by day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, and Marcus knew with unwavering certainty that he was ready to face them. If this story has touched you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced loss or injustice? How did you find the strength to move forward? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might inspire someone else who is going through a difficult time. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful and inspiring stories like this one. Together, we can keep the conversation going and continue to spread messages of hope, resilience, and justice. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll see you in the next video.